We're going to take a look at JavaScript form validation. We are going to do some custom validation, and we are going to turn off the HTML5 validation. The HTML5 validation, while it is nice, it does not have a uniform look, and there's not a uniform placement of the error messages. So by doing your own custom JavaScript validation, you can control where those error messages display, and you can control how they look. So validating our forms basically involves checking to see that a value is there if it's required. And if the value is there, if it needs a specific format, we are going to make sure that it was entered in the correct format. In order to validate your forms using only JavaScript, there are modifications that we need to make to our HTML5 form. And the first modification that we will make is to add an area to display error messages. And that area is typically below the input tags. And we use a span tag for this. We have an opening and closing span tag, and we give each section, each little error section, its own ID. That way we can target the ID using our JavaScript and display a custom message in that location. The other thing that we need to do in the HTML is add no validate in the form tag itself. No validate tells the browser to ignore HTML5 validation. So in the form, if it says required, normally if they did not fill that in, the HTML5 validation would display a message that it's required. When we say no validate, it turns off all that messaging so that we can display our own custom message. So the areas in the form that we have to change are the form tag, and then we have to add these span tags. And here is an example of a form. Now, what do we need to do in the JavaScript? First thing we need to do in the JavaScript when they click submit is we have to prevent the default behavior, because the default behavior in a form is to submit to a script or submit to a confirmation page. And we do not want that to happen. We want it to check for errors. So in the event listener, we are listening for them to click on submit. When they click on submit, prevent default is going to prevent the form from going to a confirmation screen. Okay, so we've got the event listener. It's listening for a click on the submit button, and we have an anonymous function. Anonymous function is passing in the event object. And we use that little object to call prevent default. Now, the first thing that we do in this script after prevent default is we blank out all of the error message areas. So you can see we've got get element by ID last error. And if we go and look, you can see last error is associated with that one. We've got first error that's associated with this one. And all it's doing is it's inserting a blank in between the opening and closing span tag. Right now, between the opening and closing span tag, I've got an error message. But if I key in data and I submit, I shouldn't see that error message. And that is what this code is doing. It's blanking out the error message right after they submit. So when I submit, this error message is going to go away. Okay, because technically all of them were blanked out, but the other ones were filled back in. And I'll show you that in a second. So this blanks out all of the error message areas. And then our next step is to retrieve the data from the form. So assuming they filled data in here, we have to pull the values from the form. And we're using getElementById to do that. So each of those form elements, and we can see it up here, each one has its own ID. And we're using that ID to pull the value from the form. So document.getElementById first name that value, pulls the value from the form, and stores it in this variable. Document.getElementById last name that value, pulls the value from the form, stores it in this variable. Okay, so even if there's nothing there, it's pulling nothing and storing it in the variable. These are the variables that we are going to check for validation. Right before we validate, we create an error flag. The error flag is a state variable, and it's going to indicate if there are any errors in the form. So we set it to N for no. That is the starting state. As we check for errors, if there is an error, it will get changed to yes. So the starting state is no. And then it's going to check the name. Is the name blank? If it's blank, we're going to see an error message, and the error flag is going to be set to yes. Well, in our example, it was not blank. In fact, I'll fill in last name, and I'll submit it, because last name now is not blank either. Okay, so it checked first name, checked last name, they were good. Then it got down to phone number. Well, phone number is blank. And you can see it's checking for blank, but it's also checking to make sure that the phone number is the right length, because either one of those scenarios is a problem. Email, I don't think I have. Oh, I do have. So it's also checking for email. Basically, it's saying if there is an email address, then you need to check the formatting. So that is what this is doing. It is using index of to locate the @ sign, and it's using last index of to locate the dot. And then it's checking the dot and the @ sign in relation to the other characters. So if I open up a little window here, what it's checking, it says if the @ position is less than 1. So what it's doing is it's looking for something like this. Okay? If it's less than 1, it means that the @ position is first. Well, that's a problem, okay? Because there's no email address that starts with @. Okay, so that would be an error. Okay, then we have or. Is the dot position less than the @ position plus 2? So what that is checking for is to see if the dot position is like this. Okay, that's a problem, right? You always have text between the @ and the dot. Then the third thing it's checking is to make sure that the dot position is not at the end. So what I have right now would actually flag this third error. Okay, that would be a problem because you cannot have the dot position at the end. Okay, so you need something like that, or at least 3 characters after the dot. So that's the formatting it's checking for. Um, does it ensure that the email address is correct? It ensures that it is formatted correctly, but it cannot validate the address. It's not sending an email to that email address and having them confirm. Okay. All it's doing is checking the format. So if the format is incorrect, it is going to display a message and turn on the error flag. Is not a number. That is another check you can use. And basically, if area code was entered like this, and we're saying is not a number area code, well, that is going to come back true, right? Because that's not a number. Okay, and if area code was entered like this, it would come back false because that is a number. Okay, so that is what it's checking. And to validate a form, it is not unusual to check all of the different entry areas. You have to check the required ones to make sure they're not equal to blank. Or in this case, I'm checking to see if they're equal to blank so I can display an error message and turn on the flag. It's not unusual in a numeric field to check to make sure it's a number. And it's not unusual to check for formatting, especially in phone numbers or email addresses or even web URLs. Okay, and in this code, if there's any error, that error flag gets turned on and it does not redirect. Okay, we only get into this little chunk of code if there are no errors. If there's no errors, we're going to store all the variables as local storage, and we're going to redirect to a confirmation page. Okay, but that's pretty much how you process forms. It's not a whole lot of work, and the end result looks really nice. It's much nicer than having a bunch of different sized boxes display in different locations. And you can see down here, it's catching this bad formatting that I'm doing. And only when I bypass all those errors do I actually get to the confirmation screen.